17, at the seminar, we reviewed issues of sustainable development, sustainable economic development, and inclusive economy. In 2018, the role of coordinated macroeconomic policies. In 2019, objectives and targets of sustainable development of UN in conditions of growing uncertainty and slowing down of economic growth. And this year, it is the pandemic that defined the topics and the format of this event. The pandemic launched a systemic economic crisis that the world had not seen since the times of the Great Depression. That's what the president of the Russian Federation, Mr. Putin, has stated at the summit of G20 last week. And in fact, it is true. And I should mention that the analysis of analytical agencies that make forecasts for global economy and finances are not upbeat. At the same time, it should be mentioned that the pandemic brought some new challenges that we start to work on systemically. For example, the IMF, in its recent report on global financial stability that was published in October, noted the risks for global financial stability in the nearest future are under control. Unprecedented policy measures helped to prevent unfavorable events in macroeconomics and the financial sphere, setting the path for economic recovery. Though some factors of vulnerability are increasing, so what factors do we keep in mind? Some banking systems may be in the situation where capital is deficit. Also, small companies may not be able to make their payments, and developing countries may face a deficit of funding. When we talk about financial organizations, central banks and governments, and also financial regulators in other different countries, they all looking for measures to stabilize financial situation and support economic actors. And I do believe that at our seminar, we'll be discussing only the negative impact of the pandemic. We'll be able to work out our own solutions to overcome the consequences that will be used to overcome the current situation. I propose that we should begin our seminar, and I would like to bring your attention to the fact that we have a live stream of the seminar on YouTube. And so without translation, with the original language of the speaker, so after the event, we will publish video recordings of the event, fully translated both in Russian and English. I would like to remind you that today we have a major forum and time allocated for presentations is 10 minutes. To show you slides, if you have any, you can use the green button and screen demonstration in the lower part of your Zoom screen. That's it from me for now. So being the moderator, and now I would like to give the floor for opening remarks to Mr. Glazyev from Eurasian Economic Commission. Mr. Glazyev is member of the board. He's a minister in charge of integration and macroeconomics. He is Doctor of Economic Sciences, a professor and academician of the Russian Academy of Sciences. Over to you, Sergei. Thank you for that. Igor, colleagues, I'm happy to welcome you and express my gratitude that even though there are some restrictions because the pandemic we're still able to get together in this fashion and have our seminar. In the previous seminar, we discussed financial problems, structural changes in the global economy. We discussed the turbulence in the global financial system, and it should be noted that the pandemic and whose consequences we will discuss today significantly accelerated those structural changes that we had noted previously. And there is the result of crisis restrictions that were introduced in many countries. We see significant differentiation in ratios, in rates of economic growth. Those changes that were related to the shift of the center of the economic activity to Southeast Asia, they accelerated. So now the only country in the world out of the G20 that has positive growth rates is China. And next year, China will continue to outpace others. That was happening, of course, before the pandemic. And also, advanced growth is forecasted for India. So we should acknowledge that as a result of the pandemic restrictions on economic activities, we observe further differentiations in world economy in terms of economic growth rates between other countries, different countries, depending on the effectiveness of their management system, how they manage macroeconomic stability. And I should note that we've kind of forgot that from the beginning of the year, there was a financial crash on the financial markets. So 13 trillion. So now we see recovery of financial market. So this crisis is not even, it's not homogeneous when we talk about different states and different regions of the world. So the first consequence of those pandemic trials that we have seen is acceleration of previous trends, transition from American cycle of capital accumulation to the Asian one, and shift of the center of the economy to Asia. We see forecasts of different organizations here that confirm this idea. So we talk about Russia and Eurasian Economic Union states. We are unfortunately in the middle, so we couldn't reach average global growth levels. And I think it's because of this it's a result of macroeconomic policies which are implemented in our countries. Even though we see a crisis in macroeconomic sphere, especially in the service sector, and we still are lacking investments. Capital accumulation is minor, very low levels, and investment activities are developing at slow pace, and we're still losing. We have outflow of capitals. That means our management system is not optimal in its operations. The pandemic crisis accelerated structural changes and also in terms of technologies used. We see dynamics of production in processing industries in Eurasian Economic Union countries, and uh, what we see that some differences here that medical products, pharmaceutical products are on the rise, and whatever is related to healthcare is developing fast. Healthcare and pharmaceutical industry are one of the drivers of the new technological paradigm, and the fact that the pandemic crisis has accelerated the growth of the pharmaceutical industry, the growth of IT, and also computational devices, AI, surveillance systems. So that testifies to the fact that structural technological changes are also accelerating with this shift to the new technological paradigm. So you can see the structure of this new technological paradigm. It was it grew 35%. That was a very rapid pace even before the pandemic. So the new paradigm includes uh, biotech, IT, nanotechnologies, etc. So the pandemic crisis really provided a major boost to the switch to this new paradigm. So even though many spheres are in crisis, but these areas are modernized, are growing at accelerated rates. Digitalization, so biotech technologies are outpacing others. Robotics, additive technologies, IT technologies, they really accelerate. So we observe that as a result of this global pandemic crisis, we see acceleration of structural changes in global economy. We observe, as I stated before, rapid formation of a new center of global economy located in Asia. The share of the countries that um, constitute the core of the Asian capital accumulation um, are China, India, Korea, Japan, but their number is growing, and they're the key driver of economic activity and growth. uh, Even now. So, to conclude my presentation, I would like to mention that those structural changes are very much in line with this long term theory of economic changes that says that the world is moving towards a new economic paradigm, to a new system of economic relations where it will be more diverse. Macroeconomic policies will be more diversified. Those who participate in a world economy, while with the key area of economic cooperation would be mutual investments. It's not so much about liberalization of global economy, but combination of competitive advantages of specific countries and also increasing joint investments in infrastructure in other areas. So that becomes the driver of new international cooperation, and we see um, more diverse macroeconomic policies, including China and India. They uh, have currency controls, FX controls, so they observe and follow capital movements are controlled. Investment activities are incentivized, so they have targeted tools for boosting investments. They ensure cheap long-term loans for priority areas of economic development. So money circulation under strict government control to ensure priority lending to for those entities that help develop production and develop a real sector of economy. In other words, a global system of international cooperation is changing significantly. It's more diverse. It remains global. Globalization tendencies are still in place, but the role of the state to shape new mechanisms of global cooperation is on the increase. In the Eurasian Economic Union, we closely work with China. Um, so it's part of one Road One Belt, and mutual investments is one of the aspects where we work together, developing common rules and which we put in our trade agreement with China on the basis of the existing system of regulation of international trade and international investment cooperation. We do try to develop target mechanisms to incentivize economic growth by combining our competitive advantages. So the world is becoming more diverse, policies become more selective, targeted, and we see competition takes place between the countries who will be able to offer more effective tools to incentivize investment activities to take the economy out of this dip, economic downfall that we saw this year. Thank you very much, and hopefully we'll share some great, interesting ideas today's seminar. Thank you very much, Sergei. Very interesting presentation and welcoming around. Hopefully all the presentation will be able to.
Dear participants, English speaking, I would like to check whether you have any problem with the translation.
No problem at all. Perfect.
Perfect. Very good. Very good. Я хотел бы сейчас предоставить слово.
Now I would like to give the floor to the head of the UN, Igor Paunovic, United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, head of Globalization Development Strategic Unit. He's a permanent participant of our seminars. And Mr. Paunovic has degrees in economics in Zagreb, in Croatia, and also in the United States. He worked for a long time at UN Commission in Latin America and Caribbean, and then in UNCTAD. He'll be talking scenario of the development of world economy and also development of Eurasian Economic Union after the pandemic.
Thank you very much. It is a great pleasure, as Mr. Suvorov said. We have been participating in this very important seminar from the start. We started 7 years ago. So I would like to express my gratitude to the Eurasian Economic Commission for organizing it. And as Igor said, it has become somewhat traditional to have it in the month of November every year. Let me try to share my screen with you. I hope you can see it now. If you recall, in previous years, we talked about some of the weaknesses of the trade and development perspectives and prospects in the global economy during the last decade. And obviously, we anticipated the recession this year, or the possibility of a recession. I think it's a continuation of our analysis to say something about two different scenarios for the world economy in the next decade. First of all, there are two possible ways of seeing where we stand and what the future of the world economy will be. One is obviously the Wall Street view, which basically says that everything is fine. And Wall Street has actually this week gone through the 30,000 points for the first time, meaning that there is euphoria about the future. The other is, I think, the other way of looking at the world economy is looking from the perspective of the real economy, looking from the perspective of those who are excluded or who are really suffering throughout this crisis and will suffer in the following years. And I think another news in the last week, news about the default of Zambia is actually quite telling in that respect. So I will present this second way of looking at the world economy. And this starts from the fact that we had already a weak global economy with lots of problems before the pandemic. And so even before the pandemic, the world economy was quite weak. And now during the crisis and with the pandemic, there are very big issues to be solved. And I will try to point out some of them. First of all, even with the projected rebound in 2021, we will have a $6 trillion smaller economy than what would have been without the recession. So 6 trillion will be missing from the world economy at the end of 2021, at least. And with the lockdown now in parts of Europe, this figure might be even bigger. The second important issue is that this lockdown and the packages, fiscal packages and monetary packages in developed countries really exposed the differences between the North and the South. While the North was able to mobilize all of their instruments and all of the fiscal space they had, the South was not able, and Zambia's default is a quite telling example. And also what Mr. Glazyev already said, there is uneven impact of the crisis. A vicious cycle in developing countries and only East Asia escaping from this vicious cycle. The situation is Latin America, for example, where the growth will be reduced to almost minus 10% is quite telling. So everybody started to talk about the technical rebound in 2021. What we are seeing is actually that it's not going to be a V, but a K-shaped recovery. K, because one part of the global economy, and especially the rich, already are seeing excellent results. 845 billion was added between March and September to the wealth of billionaires in the US alone. And for the rest of the world, it has been really a disaster. So can we learn from the past mistakes? How do we respond to this crisis? If you recall, in 2009, G20 London conference talked about bold global recovery, coordination of packages. Just a year after that, already fiscal austerity was on the agenda, and we had basically 10 years of very low growth. And you can see the numbers on the right-hand side. Basically, we had aborted reflation, we had unbalanced policy, basically on very expansionary monetary policy with fiscal austerity. We had this export delusion that the whole world can export its way out of the crisis. And most of all, we had debt-dependent growth. The debt figures went from 150 trillion to 250 trillion from the previous crisis, 2008-9 crisis, to 2019. So basically what we had of the growth in the last 10 years was based on that. And we already have this mixed policy messages, for example, in the UK, already signaling the need for austerity as soon as the pandemic subsides. Now, about these pre-existing conditions. First of all, unsustainable debt, you can see on the right-hand side for all developing countries how it was not just the public debt, it's the private debt that was increasing in the, especially in the last 10 years. Another problem is insufficient productive investment. Instead of going, there is also a lot of liquidity, obviously, but instead of money going into productive investment, into the real economy, it goes to assets and stocks. So we have these bubbles. We have Dow Jones with 30,000, which really is disconnected from the situation in the real economy. And we have the inequality, which is one of the basic characteristics of today's world economy. We have strong financialization of the economy. We have wage stagnation, dual economy, polarization stronger than ever, and we have business-friendly policies which are dominant and which are squeezing wages more and more. And the last pre-existing condition for the world economy to be tackled is environmental degradation, and I won't dwell into that. So from the lockdown, where do we go? What kind of strategy from 2021 or 2022? If we repeat the policy mistakes of just after the previous crisis, we will have austerity, we will have reglobalization, and we will have monetary expansion. This means that for another 10 years, we will have weak growth, weak private investment, higher deficits, higher unemployment, and lower wage share in the product. What we call this scenario is a lost decade scenario. We cannot rely just on private sector to build back better. It should be the public sector role. Its role should be much, much stronger. And also the world economy cannot export itself out of the crisis. Some countries can do that, but other countries have to import. So this delusion shouldn't be repeated. And developing countries are particularly those who will lose, and Zambia is quite a telling example. What we have done on the right-hand side, you can see two scenarios, one baseline and one growth revival scenario with more expansionary fiscal policies. And you can see that according to our model, it is possible to have quite a robust growth in the next 8 to 10 years. And with much more government spending and the GDP, government debt to GDP ratio in that higher growth scenario actually goes down compared to the baseline scenario. So this is something we should seriously consider. Of course, one of the premises of this scenario is that the wage share goes up to 54% for the world economy, meaning that there will be more demand coming from the part of the population which is actually spending much more as percentage of their income. Now, there are signs that even Financial Times is changing its tune. What you can see here, governments will have to accept a more active role in the economy, etc. This is from Financial Times. So full employment, reconnecting wages to productivity growth means active macroeconomic policies, labor market policies, incomes policies, if we want to turn these negative trends. We also need progressive tax measures, controlling especially corporate rent seeking. You see what is going on in many sectors with huge companies actually preventing competition in their part of the market. And in the South, we need diversification, industrial policy plus financial support and technology transfer needed from the outside. Fiscal space is obviously one of the key concepts to have in mind. And I think what Finance Minister of Ghana said in June is quite telling. Suddenly, the Western world can print $8 trillion to support their economies in these extraordinary times, while Africans are judged by the old rules. You really feel like shouting, "I can't breathe." This means that the North has much more fiscal space than the South. So there is a need to help developing countries to get over this crisis and to have much more access to financing than in the what was the case in this year. And we are proposing some of the measures like SDR allocation, tackling illicit financial flows, putting brake on capital flows with capital controls. We need moratorium on related trade-related and investment measures during the pandemic, and we need much better coordination, especially G20 and United Nations agencies. In the next period, reviving multilateralism will be needed because current system doesn't provide the policy space and the financial support as it should. So we are also presenting some of the proposals in this year's Trade and Development Report, how to reshape the global architecture to be better suited for developmental purposes of all. And just to conclude with regional prospects, because the global value chains will be shorter in the future, and this is quite obvious because of the pandemic, but some other forces too. So regional value chains will become more dominant, and the larger role of state, bigger role of the public sector. So this presents opportunities for the Eurasian Economic Union. But we need active policies. So we have to see what is possible and how to convert this potential into reality by actively analyzing what to do and how to do. And for this, I think the kind of importance that the Eurasian Economic Commission has will be probably even larger in the next 10 years. So to conclude, there are two ways to look at the future. Either we stick to the previous scenario of fiscal austerity, and we are on the path to lost decade in that case, or we have a complete reorientation of the policy mix, and we give the public sector much bigger role, and then we can have higher growth rates, and we can tackle some of the pre-existing conditions that I talked about. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Igor. Спасибо большое. Спасибо за интересную презентацию.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the interesting presentation. I'd like to draw attention to the fact that we're getting that our speakers are getting questions, but considering that that we're quite limited on time when it comes to, I propose maybe just one question per speaker, and then we'll do all of the other questions towards the end of our session. And of course, I'd like you to adhere to the time frames. And as a moderator, I'd like to use the opportunity to ask one question for Igor Paunovic. Do you think that the pandemic would increase the world economy deglobalization trend?
Well, the pandemic has already dented globalization, but globalization is not something which is out of our control. This is a result of the policies. If you remember, in the 1980s, with Thatcher and Reagan, there was a big push towards different types of policies, and institutions, global institutions were changed, policies were changed. So we had more and more globalization because of the policies adopted. Now, what kind of policies the world will adopt at this juncture, it's not really clear. We have mixed tendencies. We have policies which are going towards more opening up, but we are at the same time having policies which are more protectionist, which means deglobalization. So at the current juncture, in my opinion, it is not possible to say in which direction we are going to go. However, I hope that more active policies will be accompanied, more active at the national level, will be accompanied by more multilateral policies, which means that globalization can proceed, but with quite a different set of measures, which would be actually more beneficial for developing countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Igor. There will be more questions at the end. Я хотел бы сейчас предоставить слово господину.
Right now, I'd like to pass the floor. I'd like to pass the floor to Mr. Haraguchi, the head of trade policy question department with UNITA. The topic of Mr. Haraguchi's speech is the influence of the pandemic on the industrial sectors globally and the Eurasian Economic Union. Please take it forward.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me and see me.
Yes.
Thank you first, Mr. Glazyev, and also to Eurasian Economic Commission for inviting UNIDO to this very important annual seminar. We are very pleased to join this seminar with other distinguished speakers. Let me share my screen. Okay, I hope you can see the slide. First, I would like to emphasize importance of manufacturing for SDG and also recovery process, because I'm focusing on production sector, which needs to play a crucial role for steady macroeconomic recovery. And I would like to first emphasize the importance of manufacturing in this process for countries start making progress again toward sustainable development goals. And then I would like to move to my main topic, world industries under COVID crisis and impact on Eurasian economic region. And also I will look at particularly the case of Russia. Here, the development trends of different technology groups and Eurasian economy and Russia will be highlighted relative to world average, and also impacts of COVID-19 on different industries. As the first speaker from IMF discussed, I will also look into the impacts on industries with different characteristics. And I will also illustrate the relationships between policy measures taken and impacts on manufacturing industries. And finally, I will conclude by discussing the situation firms with different size. Okay. First, why manufacturing matters. A recent publication by UNIDO confirms positive association between industrialization and then achievement of SDGs. This, we looked at the relationship between SDG index. Index is defined as a composite index, which quantifies all the 17 goals and combines them into a y-index on the basis of equal weights to all 17 goals. And manufacturing intensity here is defined as manufacturing value added per capita. As you see the figure, the overall industrialization is associated with countries' progress in achieving SDG. And here, the same publication shows the evidence of direct positive impacts from SDG 9 on especially poverty reduction and economic growth, but also on health, decent work, affordable and clean energy, responsible consumption and production, and climate action. Besides these direct positive impacts, there are indirect impacts on education, reduced inequality, and clean water and sanitation through economic growth. And this once again shows the importance of SDGs, not only for the sake of industrialization, but in the process of recovery in different sectors, different dimensions of development, and for achieving SDGs. Okay, now industries under COVID-19 crisis. Here we see world maps, one for GDP and one for manufacturing value added growth. And lighter colors indicate positive growth. Yellow is the highest growth, more than 10%. And darker colors indicate negative growth. And dark blue is the highest negative growth. And as you see, the world had already slower growth in 2019, especially in Americas and Russia. And clearly, COVID pandemic precipitated countries into negative range for both GDP and NBA, except for some African countries. The negative impacts were especially strong in North and South Americas, India and Australia. And here, when we compare GDP and MBA in 2020, overall, manufacturing was hit harder than economies in general. Here we look at the impacts on total manufacturing production over time since 2005. Here we use the index of industrial production. 2005 is the base year. Here we can compare the two crises, 2008 financial crisis and our current crisis. For the world as a whole, manufacturing experienced, of course, sharper decline during the COVID crisis and the 2008 financial crisis. But we have witnessed a quicker recovery, at least so far. The financial crisis inflicted also a massive impact on the manufacturing industries, but it took a bit of time for shock to transmit from the epicenter of the crisis to the rest of the world. The impact of the financial crisis spread largely through trade and global value chains channels. And so the industries exposed to falling supply and demand were hit hardest. The recovery process prolonged because world leading manufacturers in advanced countries have to go through the restructuring process and they have to clean up their financial debt. On the other hand, the impacts of the COVID crisis originated from both foreign and domestic sources through trade as well as domestic containment measures. That is the reason why the impact was immediate, as foreign and domestic oriented firms received impacts almost simultaneously. And here we look at different technology groups of manufacturing industries. The orange indicates medium and high-tech industries, which includes, for example, motor vehicles, chemicals, electronic machineries, and machinery and equipment industries. And yellow one, medium tech industries. These are mostly resource-based industries like refined petroleum, basic metals, and rubber and plastics. And red ones are low-tech industries, including textiles, food processing, wearing apparel, wood products, and so on. And as you see, all technology groups have been severely affected by COVID. They have experienced, however, quite quick recovery, but among them, recovery of low-tech groups seems weakest. And here we look at manufacturing performance of Eurasian Economic Region and Russian Federation relative to the global. The blue one is Russia, and yellow one is Eurasian Economic Region, and red one is global. So Eurasian Economic Region, EER, follow the trend of the world manufacturing development quite closely. Here, EER includes only Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Russian Federation due to the data limitation. But the pandemic shock on EER's manufacturing sector was milder than the world average. EER as a whole has already regained the loss they experienced due to the pandemic, while Russia has been also doing better than the world average. And here we look at closely the impacts of COVID by different industry. And here industries are listed in the order of the highest to lowest impact at the global level. So the blue bar indicates global, and red one for Eurasia Economic Region, and yellow is for Russia. And this is based on index of industrial production. And we are comparing 2020 April and 2019 April. Here, as you see, most manufacturing industries had negative growth, but impact differs by industry. Globally, the wearing apparel industry was hit hardest by the pandemic. It is followed by leather, motor vehicle industries. And these are the ones mostly integrated into global value chains or export-oriented industries. On the other hand, at a global level, the impacts on resource-based and more domestic-oriented industries were less severe. Like chemical industry and food industry has almost no impact. The pharmaceutical industry, understandably, recorded positive growth, as also the first speaker from the IMF pointed out this trend. And EER, Eurasian Economic Region, has followed the world trends, but some industry had much severe impacts than the global average, such as transport equipment, fabricated metals, and beverages. But on the other hand, its paper and pharmaceutical industry have done much better than the rest of the world. And Russia largely followed the EER trend, but its motor vehicle industry and electronical equipment industry were negatively affected by the pandemic much more than the region. And here we take a look at relationship between the policy measures taken and industrial performance. The y-axis is a stringency index. It evaluates the country's containment measures. The higher number is, the measure is more strict. And x-axis is based on index of industrial production. And here, it is interesting to see that Kazakhstan and Russia have implemented relatively stringent containment measures, but still the performance of their manufacturing industry were better than world average. In the case of Belarus, its manufacturing sector performed relatively well under less stringent containment measures. Of course, if this crisis prolongs, it will get harder for governments to maintain high levels of containment measures, as well as economic support measures. So in this regard, it is important to review the experiences of various countries systematically and learn lessons with regard to what have worked and what did not work, and how much governments had to spend to implement these measures. Based on such a lesson learning exercise, countries can increasingly focus on measures that give higher returns on public spending. And finally, I would like to conclude by looking at a bit of the micro level, farm level. This is based on Russian data, the impacts on farms by different size. Here we looked at medium size with employees from 20 to 99 and larger farms, more than 100 employees. And when the survey asked whether they had a permanent closure of operations, none of the farms, neither in medium or large groups, said that they had permanent closure. But as for temporary closure, around 80% of medium-sized farms said they had a temporary closure due to COVID-19 impact. And only 60% of large farms said that they had temporary closure. And when we look into their performance, changes in sales, around 76% of surveyed medium firms said they experienced a decrease in their monthly sales. Only 42% of large firms said they had experience in decline in sales. And then when the survey asked how much they experienced this decline, drop in sales, medium sized firms said they had to reduce sales by around 40%. As for large firms, they reduced sales around 35%. And there are firms which did not experience any sales decline. And this, of course, as you can imagine, the share is much higher for large firms. Around 50% of the large firms said that they have no decline in the sales. And only 20% of medium firms said they have no decline in sales. So the COVID pandemic had a massive impact on the performance of world manufacturing industries, as well as manufacturing industries of Eurasian economic region. And their recovery is important for the countries to start making progress again to move toward SDGs. And at the same time, we need to consider this is an opportunity to learn lessons. We see different impacts on different industries and different impacts on farms with different characteristics. Based on this experience, we need to build more resilient manufacturing industries in order to move toward more inclusive and sustainable industrial development in the future. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Mr. Haraguchi. In view of the time constraint, we will leave the questions to you for the end of our session. Сейчас я хотел бы...
And now I would like to give the floor to Yaroslav Lisovolik, Program Director of Valdai Discussion Club. Mr. Lisovolik is a Doctor of Economic Sciences, Professor of Global Economy of Academy of Exterior Ministry.
Thank you so much. I'm very happy to have the opportunity to take part in this event. My speech will mostly have to do with the issues of regionalism and its role in the context of the current crisis. And in my opinion, the key concern that could be shared at the point is that regionalism perhaps is largely underrated. Its role, in a way, to a degree, the world economy resists the effects of the current economical crisis, and especially important is the role of regionalism in the conditions of growing protectionism that was growing in the world economy over the past few years, and that was largely strengthened in many sectors of economy during the current crisis as well. And I think that perhaps it could be stated that largely a significant part of the openness of the markets that we've seen over the past few years in the context, both in the as well as in the context of the current crisis, was provided for by trade liberalization within the regional agreements, within regionalism. And in the course of this year, perhaps a deciding factor that speaks in favor of the role of regionalism in opening up of the markets is the conclusion of the regional partnership that was announced literally a few weeks ago, and that became the most wide-scale regional agreement on trade liberalization in the world. It's about 30% of global GDP that's allocated to it. And I think in conclusion, I think this agreement made within the context of the current crisis is especially important, considering the fact that it's that it could really provide a significant impulse for the opening up of the markets within the next few years. Possibly, it is the creation of such an agreement that could provide an impulse for transition from the dominant paradigm of the past few years, which is protection towards more openness in the markets, and perhaps we will see to some degree attempts of response to the challenge from all-encompassing regional economic partnership and attempts to create a wide-scale economical blocks that will try to compete for trade flows, for investments with this bloc. Perhaps that such a competitor within the next few years could be a trans-Pacific partnership that was not joined by the US earlier, and this issue could be reconsidered within the next few years. And the emergence of such a powerful bloc with the US on board as a part of the regional alliance, Trans-Pacific Partnership could seriously strengthen the competition between the two mega blocs in the Pacific region. I think that in that regard, it is very important to have the regional blocks that are created now, especially if they are such of such large scale. It's important for them to be open and inclusive rather than would have a exclusive character. And in that point, from the point of view of further growth of the all-encompassing regional economic partnership, there is a whole range of issues that comes up, and one of such issues is perhaps a possible collaboration from Russia, from the Eurasian Economical Union with this major regional bloc. And another issue that I think is quite important is the coherence of such a wide-scale regional project with other Eurasian initiatives and other Eurasian integrational projects and global projects. And in that regard, I think that it's quite an important direction that could be taken is not so much the actual trade liberalization, but also the issues that have to do with transport coherence, investment collaborations, and here I think we should have quite an open view of what opportunities this provides for the economy of the Eurasian region and for the world economy. Perhaps such formation of such a major regional bloc in the world could also cause a certain response from regionalism in regards to the current crisis. Perhaps we will see better coordination between regional integrational projects in response to the current crisis. And from our side, from Eurasian Economical Union, for the past few years, we have been seeing a lot of efforts made in making connections and collaborations with other blocs, including Mercosur and ASEAN, and perhaps as a part of our response to current crisis, we can consider the issue of coordination on a global scale in terms of collaboration between the regional economical blocks as well as between their development institutes. For instance, if we're speaking of the Eurasian Economical Union as a regional bloc, we also have the Eurasian Development Bank. We also have EFSAR and just in many other regions and with other regional blocs. There are development institutes and consolidation and creation of a certain alliance of sorts between the development institutes could become an important aspect of a response of our response to the current crisis in order to form significant resources for the launch of anti-crisis measures. Actually, I think that from the point of view of anti-crisis measures that we've seen over the past year, including those by G20, other than insignificant role of regionalism and regional institutes at the moment. To a larger degree, those coordinated measures and coordinated anti-crisis measures and stimuli should consider and incorporate regional development institutes, regional economical blocks, integration blocks. It is even more important from the point of view of passing anti-crisis impulses from the G20 countries to the other countries that are not part of the G20, and the use of not just anti-crisis stimuli among the G20 countries, but also involving the regional integration blocks allows to improve the conductivity of such anti-crisis impulse to the regional partners and can significantly multiply the effect of anti-crisis measures on the other countries. And I think it's especially important now when we are looking at how we can strengthen the effect of the anti-crisis measures to other economies. And other than our global response, I think regionalism will also change from the point of view of how it evolves in response to the current crisis. And undoubtedly, issues will be raised of how the regional integrational blocks and their development institutes should prepare for the next crisis. And just like I said, I spoke of the need to not just wait for the next crisis, but to create certain interaction scheme in advance, interaction scheme between the countries and between the regional partners in response to a possible crisis. The same applies to regional integrational groups. A similar work needs to be done to look at how openness of markets is supported, how joint stimuli are conducted, including financial structure, and how immigration interaction takes place. And we see some very difficult consequence with labor migration for both Eurasian economy and the countries that are dependent on money transfers. There are a lot of questions to be asked for regionalism, its future development, as being ready for future crises. And I think that these conclusions and these studies will be conducted in order for us to be better prepared for the future challenges. Thank you for your time. Thank you so much, Yaroslav. I'd like to give the participants an opportunity to ask one question for Mr. Lisovolik. Does anyone have questions? Okay, there are no questions. Well, I have a question, if you don't mind. Mr. Lisovolik, what do you think? In what direction the platform of Eurasian economical collaboration due to the pandemic and its consequences? Well, I think that largely the work is being conducted on improving coordination of interaction between the countries, including the measures taken in response to the crisis. But I think that regarding what I spoke of during my main presentation is that perhaps in the future we could work on some scenarios for next crises and to consider how these crises can develop in the future and what joint measures can be taken by our countries that could be developed. And I think that from the coordination standpoint from the point of macroeconomical policy and structural measures in response to crisis, I think there's a lot to be discussed. And perhaps some scenario responses could be developed for the possible crisis development options that may emerge in the future. And I also think that from the point of view of preparation to such external shocks and challenges in the future, we also need to consider the possibilities for forming alliances between the Eurasian Economical Union and other regional blocs, and with the development institutes, with development banks, in order to form a resource pool that can be used, or some joint projects, a set of joint projects that could be financed in order to support the economical activities, to support the economy at the times of crisis. It could be infrastructure projects, but we can see that there is a demand in the global economy, first of all, in the area of services. Services have to do with development of human capital. I think we should consider collaboration in that area, including financing of the issues of healthcare financing. Thank you so much, Yaroslav, for your very specific recommendation that I hope will be considered in the future work of Eurasian Commission as well. I'd like to pass the floor to Ms. Lilia Aleksanyan. She's economist with the Regional Cooperation Department at the Asian Development Bank. She has a PhD in economy, attended Paris School of Economy. Lilia, please take the floor.
Thank you very much.
Presentation will be in English. Sorry, I'll do full screen mode. Can you see it? Can you see my presentation?
Yes, we can see it. Yeah, very clear. Please go on. Please go on.
So my presentation is about the COVID-19 crisis in the Caucasus and Central Asia region. So the Caucasus and Central Asia region comprises 5 countries of Central Asia, so Kazakhstan, Kyrgyz Republic, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan, and 3 countries of the Caucasus, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. The COVID-19 crisis, the COVID-19 outbreak continues to spread across the region of the Caucasus and Central Asia. The chart on the left shows the evolution of confirmed COVID-19 cases since the beginning of the outbreak in the region in March 2020. The chart on the right shows death rates per capita in the region's countries. So as of November 25, between the region recorded between 1,200 and 43,000 COVID-19 cases per million people, and death rates between 9 and 688 people. And as you can see from the graph on the right side, Armenia, Georgia, and the Kyrgyz Republic are the hardest, are hit the hardest in the region. So the region's countries responded very quickly to the pandemic with swift measures to mitigate and contain the virus. Countries introduced a range of policies to restrict foreign and countrywide travel. They closed businesses and schools, canceled public gatherings, mobility restrictions, stay-at-home orders, etc. And you can see that the main share of these public health and social measures were implemented at the very beginning of the COVID-19 outbreak in March, while by October and September, the number of measures were considerably lower compared to the beginning of the outbreak in March. However, in almost all countries of the region, the stringency of these measures have been declining since May, June, and you can see that the controlled reduction in stringency of these measures in the region since August saw growth in cases in most countries of the region. For example, that's the case of Georgia, but also the case of the Kyrgyz Republic. And as you can see on the slide, on the graph at the right side, the continued reduction, these necessary public health responses to the pandemic have also greatly decreased mobility at the beginning of the pandemic. But as you can see, by September and October, most of these countries have been back to pre-outbreak levels of mobility, non-residential mobility, by September and October. So these containment measures were very important to stop the COVID-19 outbreak, but they also entailed large short-term economic costs. So you can see these graphs, the shock on industrial production, but also on the services sector, retail trade, transportation services, and accommodation and food services. And all these graphs are for the region of the Caucasus and Central Asia. Containment measures have had on average a very large impact on economic and activity. For example, in the case of industrial production, it contracted by around 5% each month on average during the period that followed the implementation of containment measures. And not surprisingly, retail trade recovered with the easing of lockdown measures as consumers' discretionary spending was revived with the reopening. However, in contrast to households, firms, businesses remained more cautious to respond to this revival, to the reopening of economies. And as you can see, all other sectors, especially services tech sectors that are contact intensive service sectors, such as transportation services, accommodation and food services, they were hit especially hard and have not yet recovered. And this can already show us that a continued reversal of containment measures, even if economies are back to reopenings, it is the scaring of the crisis is still there, and it is not apparent. The recovery is not apparent with the weak recovery of these sectors, of the services sectors in particular. One particularity of the region of the Caucasus and Central Asia is their high dependency on remittances and tourism revenues. And the economic shock of the COVID-19 crisis has been magnified by the loss of remittances and also a huge contraction in tourist inflows in the region. The two graphs here represent the contraction of remittances flows and tourist inflows as they are reflected in the balance of payments during the first half of the year. The Kyrgyz Republic and Tajikistan in particular are major remittance receiving countries where net remittances reach about 30% of their GDP, while they represent around 10% of GDP for Georgia and Armenia. Tourism revenues are also a major source of external revenues for Armenia and Georgia. And the COVID-19 crisis does revealed again the region's long-standing structural weaknesses, structural vulnerabilities, such as the dependency on tourism and revenues. This is particularly the case of oil importing countries of the region. However, oil exporting countries of the region have vulnerabilities of dependency on exposure and are highly exposed to oil price volatilities. With the low demand, however, inflation at the beginning of the COVID-19 outbreak, inflation has accelerated. However, in the second half of the year, inflation have been on the decreasing trend, and this is despite inflationary pressures that came from currency depreciation almost in all countries of the region. And you can see that, for example, in some countries at the beginning of the crisis of the outbreak, depreciation of their currency exchange rate against US dollar achieved around 15%, even if since then it has recovered partly. And let's move to policy responses of countries to contain these negative effects of the shock. So as of today, almost all central banks had cut their policy rates. So if we compare the monetary policy rate in the countries of the Caucasus and Central Asia, we can see that almost all countries except Kyrgyz Republic have cut their policy rates, and the cuts were very important, more than 100 basis points, especially in Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Armenia. Regarding fiscal policy, the more than half, so COVID-19 crisis have prompted governments to take unprecedented fiscal actions and that amounted almost 16 billion US dollar for the whole region, which is around 5% of regional GDP. More than half of fiscal actions that governments took to respond to the crisis are considered as additional spending, or in other words, foregone revenue. It includes also temporary tax cuts, etc., while the rest of fiscal actions were mostly liquidity support, such as loans, guarantees, and capital injection by the public sector. And as you can see on the graph on the right side, the size and composition of fiscal support has varied by country, and it reflects in part countries' available fiscal space. For example, in the case of oil exporting countries of the region, which are Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan, you can see that the bulk of their they concentrate the bulk of the region's fiscal response, and that's because of the tighter financing, the constraints and available oil export revenues. And if we go back to compare the current crisis with the two past crises that hit this region, and the two crises are the global financial crisis of 2008-2009, but also the oil price shock crisis of 2014-15. If we compare to this crisis, we can see that there is a slight difference of policy responses. For example, the region's countries, in the case of the oil price shock, the region's countries have almost all increased their policy rate because of inflationary pressures coming from currency depreciation at that stage. As I showed in my previous slide, you can see that during this COVID crisis, the region's countries have available monetary space to cut their interest rates. And regarding the fiscal policy, however, as you can see, after both crises, both 2008-2009 and oil price shock crisis 2014-15, the debt levels of increased a lot for both oil importers and both oil exporters, and that contributed to major debt buildups in the region. And at the end, it reached record high levels and of debt to GDP level, which also limited fiscal space for future economic downturns, such as the current crisis. And this, which means that when this new crisis came to this region, countries had very limited initial conditions, pre-existing conditions to respond to the crisis with available tools, with available monetary and fiscal tools. So to face the current COVID-19 crisis that was unprecedented, both with direct and indirect impacts, the region's countries had only a limited policy space and also limited initial conditions. And the main reason for that was the pre-existing structural and long-standing vulnerabilities that I just mentioned, the dependency on external revenues such as tourism revenues, remittances, and oil revenues. Before the COVID-19 crisis, weak external demand and subdued oil prices lowered current account balances, while fiscal deficits contributed to rising debt levels. So you can see that in 2019, countries were not ready to respond to the crisis as they were back to 2014-15 crisis because their current account and fiscal account balances have not were very weak to respond to the COVID-19 crisis. So as the pandemic continues, policymakers now should promote recovery, while at the same time they need still to address the health crisis. So in the medium term, what is important for the countries is to build and rebuild buffers that will guard them against future shocks like this COVID-19 crisis. And in particular, they need to address structural vulnerabilities that amplified the shock for the region. Thank you for your attention.
Many thanks, Lilia. And I will ask the participant about questions. Есть ли вопросы, госпоже Лилия Алексанян?
Do you have any questions for Madam Aleksanyan? I have one question for you.
You are working in Asian Development Bank. And is Asian Development Bank taking any actual actions or measures in Central or Eastern Asia to help to cope with COVID-19?
Yes, the Asian Development Bank was very quickly provided many different support to its developing member countries of the region. The main instrument was called CIPRO, Coronavirus Pandemic Response Option. With that tool, governments, they provided budget support to most countries of the region, and the support reached, so the whole support for the whole Asia Pacific region was about $2 billion, and one share of that budget support came to the region of the Caucasus and Central Asian countries. Beyond that budget support instruments, the ADB also provided technical assistance support, provided various knowledge assistance support to the countries, and also to respond to health issues, but also non-health related issues. And by the end of August, most countries of the region have received, almost all countries of the region have received different type of support measures from ADB.
Oh, very interesting. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
And now I would like to give a floor to our all standing participant, Mikic. Mikic, она является главой подразделения.
She is the head of the Department on Trade, Investments and Innovations of ESCADO. And from what I understand, today Mia will be making presentation. Okay, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Suvorov. I'm very pleased to be with you again this year, although you know, my presence in the previous years was always online. So I am just keeping in a tradition and hoping one day that it will be in presence participation. Thank you very much for inviting ESCAP again. And this time I will be focusing my presentation, and I promise I will try my best to keep it to 10 minutes, as you told me, on really exploring the resilience of global value chains and where we can go with possible reconfiguration. I think my good friend Igor has hinted in his talk also about this, and as well as other speakers. Let me just remind everyone that the phase of globalization or hyper-globalization has actually stopped already at the peak of the global financial crisis. in 2008, as you can see in this graph. And after that, it was really on a downward trend. Obviously, after 2015, we had a major sort of a shock into the system through the trade war between China and United States, which contributed more, I think, directly towards looking into how the global value chains will be reconfigured to meet the challenges of that trade war. And then and that caused the slowing down of overall trade, but within that also the portion of the trade that was linked to the value chains. And then, of course, on top of this came a pandemic with all sorts of measures and the policies that impacted directly and indirectly trade, investment, and of course, national economies, as we heard from the presentations so far. So in the back of my slides, I have added actually a number of slides that have some statistical data on the performance of trade in the region. And I'm not going to be talking about that, but I hope when you get to see the slides, you will be able to also refer to those. So focusing on the value chains, let me very quickly go through the genesis of the problems of what was happening in the context of this pandemic. So it is really referring mostly on what was happening this year, although some of the issues have, of course, persisted before. Now, in this pandemic, we have faced people call it mother of all crises, etc., because it was a troika of three different shocks, right? It was the health shock, it was supply shock, and still is in the context, but remaining shock is the demand shock, right? In the global financial crisis, we had demand shock only. And so obviously, when you have this troika of shocks, it's very difficult to find the proper reaction of policymakers. And rightly so, policymakers were focused on the health crisis because they didn't have the health sector response. They didn't have the health sector that was capable of responding to the challenges of the pandemics. They turned to the next best response, which was containment of the modality of carrying the pandemic around, which was mobility of people and goods. And therefore they locked down, as it was explained, most of the world, and that caused then the more visible issues with the movement of goods. Of course, services, I'm not going to go much, but movement of goods across the borders. Obviously, supply the first instance, the locked down in China, in Hubei province, which is the main actually supplier of many parts and components, car industry to Korea or pharma industry to India, etc., caused initial shortage in supply, and of course was then fed into the contagion further on. But as that evolved, there was then the main things. And the issue with that is that the GVCs, as they were constructed before that, were not taking into account these sorts of risks, right? The operation of the value chains was just in time, a minimum inventory, efficiency to the maximum, etc. So they were not able to react to that, even in the occasions where it was possible to perhaps find the substitute sources. All right. The added element that caused this disruptions, in the supply chains, were the reactions of the governments faced with this huge uncertainty, right? So the countries that actually produce the medical supplies or other essential goods, etc., started to actually look into what they will be doing with them, whether they will continue exporting or not. Many actually, as you see in this graph, hopefully just the graphics shows lots of red, meaning that many countries in the region opted to constrain the trade, and then based on the data being still collected through the WTO or other sources, there are still more than almost 100 of countries that are restricting the supply. And why they were doing that is because they really had no clear guidance in terms of what to do with the policies. There is a nominal sort of a norm or a spirit in the WTO in which it said, okay, countries will not be doing export control, but that is actually not being put in a language that how not to apply it, for what period of time, etc. So the guidance in none of the regional or multilateral agreements was clearly there. And then secondly, what added to all of that is that many countries that needed or realized that the trade could have been less disrupted if they adopted non-paper-based procedures for clearance, etc., had infrastructure ready to do that, whether hard infrastructure or regulatory infrastructure. Some of them were able to actually speedily bring in temporary regulations, etc. Were able to actually put processes in place, and we are only hoping that these will continue as permanent measures. So on the basis of that, the impression, and particularly in terms of the markets related to the essential goods like masks, ventilators, everything related to the medical products, the impression of general public, the health providers, governments, etc., was that the supply chains do not work, right? And so we need to do something else in order to assure that the supply of such products will be always there in both quantity, quality, price that we normally want to have them. Now, this is and all such sort of opinion or sentiment was relabeled in terms of wanting to have the supply chains to be resilient. There are many issues, and literature deals with that in a sense of to defining what resilient means. Resilient means that basically you can go back to what it was once the shock is actually removed. Okay, our shock, which is pandemic, is far from being removed. So we are talking more or less about robustness of these chains, which is the requirement for the chain to operate under any circumstances. Now, that condition makes the chains very expensive, because it requires a completely different approach, business models, investment, regulatory, etc., that need to be put in place to allow for that, right? And so let me just give you some sort of insights into that in a context of how to go from the current easily disrupted value chains in some of the sectors, not all of them, to something else. So first of all, you can do diversification of your supplier base so that you can better manage the risks. That will cause increase in costs because you will be losing economies of scale. It will be difficult to find the proper quality and the price, and it will take time. And so in all of that, the bottom line is the products will be more expensive. So we need to understand whether what is the trade-off, if you wish. I don't like to use that term, but between the higher prices and the assurances of having supply at the moment of time when we want. Another thing is to introduce redundancy into the supply chains, to introduce really a surplus that you will be holding on. And in case when the demand rises, as it did in the medical products 50 times or more, you will be able to actually take the stocks and put it to the market. We, us that are a little bit older, remember that we had many global or regional stocks of many of the commodities, etc. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But it again, the implication is that in many of the products it will increase the price, unless and also in terms of management, etc. It is very complex and difficult, and the onuses, the burden will be on the governments to actually introduce that. The good thing is that with the advance of technology, and since we are not dealing with many of the products that come from the natural resources, etc., some of these are actually being able to be produced at the demand, right? So that the 3D printing, etc., can help in that. So hopefully part of that can be used as a solution. The third one is really for the government to take the responsibility and to say, hey, what is our role in actually securing a proper supply of certain essential goods? And so then to invest in that and create a proper sort of conditions for that to be there. More of that can be read in literature. I don't have time. So the question now is, with the reconfiguration of the value chains that, many of them sit into three different spaces in the world. Most of it that we talk about is in Asia, centered on the hub that is in China, but includes wider Asia. Then we have a European hub, and then North American hub. The question now, of course, is, and I'm not going into geopolitics and commenting on until we go into questions on how the governments actually try to push the companies or not to move from certain localities to somewhere else. But when the firms are making the decisions, the anchor firms, the lead firms on where they will be producing, they need to look at the technology. Can they use technology to replace the source of, say, cheap labor? And is it readily available? How expensive it is, etc. And how long it will take to put it in place? Are these new localities having infrastructure that is necessary, regulation plus the hard infrastructure? How long does it take to put the technology for the production in place? Because supply chains don't happen overnight. It takes years to establish the international production network. Where are the consumers? Are they actually in America? Are they in Europe? Are they somewhere else? And then increasingly, the decisions are also taking into account emotional factors, made in certain places, right? National a sort of patriotism or other factors, right? So when we look at the JVCs in Asia, these are the possible configurations that we will see. We will see some of the chains remaining in Asia, but they will be then catering for the Asian demand. Some will stay in Asia, and then they will cater still for the demand in Europe or United States, etc. Some will actually go and reshore or go somewhere else and produce from that other location, maybe Mexico or some in Africa, etc. Some will actually go home and stay to produce for home. This is something that Mr. Trump was referring to, that he wants American companies to actually go to America and produce for an American market, maybe for export if they are actually at all competitive. And some will say, look, I don't care about any of that. I'm fine as I am, and I will be remaining with my business model that I have. I can't go through this slide or the next one, but I do refer to it because it gives you the indices or the indicators of how much the various countries in Asia are actually integrated in simple and more complex regional and global value chains. And by looking at that, you can then see which countries are actually candidates for the possible relocation of parts of the value chains that I was mentioning about. Obviously, everyone knows that the first country that comes to mind is Vietnam, and then we have countries like Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, Mexico, etc. So let me now very quickly go to the issue of a regional comprehensive economic partnership, which is at present the largest trading bloc that was signed on the 15th of November. It has 10 ASEAN countries and 5 dialogue partners, China, Republic of Korea, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. It is a comprehensive agreement because it includes, in addition to the trio that normally is part of many agreements, liberalization in goods, services, investment, it has other chapters: intellectual property rights, competition, e-commerce, small and medium-sized enterprises, etc. Now, not all of them go to the very sophisticated level of providing binding provisions, but they go quite a long way in there. They do not have the chapters on labor, environmental, state-owned enterprises, and that was expected because most of the countries involved actually do have large involvement of state in the business. And in Japan it's different, in Korea it's different, in China it's different, in Australia, New Zealand it's different, but it's still there. And so none of these countries were actually very keen to go into that area. Uniqueness of that agreement is that it is the only one that puts China, Japan, and Republic of Korea in the same rules of trade. And it has significant geopolitical and geoeconomic significance. The other sort of feature, a unique one, is that it brings together the poorest and the richest countries in terms of GDP per capita, such as Cambodia and Brunei Darussalam. It does contain flexibilities for the lower income countries in terms of not what they need to liberalize in, but how long do they have. So some of the countries will have up to 20 years. They will have to defend that in the WTO, but they do project a long period of liberalization. They will put in place their own secretariat, which is also extremely important because it may signal that they will be creating new rules, not completely as the European Union, but in certain contexts. And they are open for the accession. So India, that withdrew from the negotiations last year, will have easier access as soon as the agreement is ratified. And other countries will have to wait for a year and a half after the agreement is put in force to actually apply for the accession. Very quickly, the main benefit of this across the region, rules of origin, with very, very easy countries because of the cumulative rules of origin to strengthen regional value chains. And so it will play a role in terms of this relocation. It is welfare increasing because and I don't have calculations here, but in the annex, it does compensate for the losses that were brought to the world economy through the American-Chinese trade war. And it is friendly because of the rules of origin and how it is actually set, and at the depth of some of the chapters, like investment in terms of dispute settlement, allows developing countries and those that actually care about making benefits for all to accede easily to this agreement. But for us, in UN, it doesn't go all the way because it includes only East and Southeast Asian countries. All of these white areas that you can see, that is the whole Asia, are remaining not included. And so we will rather see how more countries will actually come into play. And to help these countries, we are really working with all of them in terms of improving supply chains towards building back better, to include the pillars of digitalization, making them more diverse in terms of partners and the modes of connections in terms of transport, ICT, etc., decarbonized, and then depending on the regional additional agreements in terms of the mutual recognition of standards, making them within the like-minded countries that can agree on certain things like no tariff increase or roll back on certain other measures, etc. And of course, inclusive, because we want everyone to benefit from trade. And rationale for doing that is that the crisis that we are in is not a single space crisis localized. It is cross the border. Solutions need to be cross the border. And the requirement is to have this regional cooperation and integration. We have examples of the modalities and the frameworks through which we work. The one that is really helping already some of the countries because they're preparing towards implementation is the paperless trade. The UN treaty will come into force on the 20th of February of 21, because we now have, after China has ratified, a sufficient number of countries to put it in force and to move really strongly with implementation. And then we are looking with the whole UN family and WTO and some other partners. We are actually coming up with the better regional trade agreement provisions for the times of crisis. And then, of course, we already have some transport networks that can allow choosing better diversified sort of modalities in transport that can help resilience building. So let me stop here and apologies for not perhaps sticking to the time, but I tried my best, and I apologize to the interpreters because I know I have spoken too fast. So thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Mia. And yes, it's a bit out of time. We are now, and I think future questions to future speakers, we will have to refer to the end of this session. But I can't stop myself asking one question. So trade war between United States and China started under Trump administration. What is your feeling? What will happen under new administration in this respect?
Well, Mr. Suvorov, we don't have glass ball, right? And there are so many comments that have been put in there. But new administration with the leadership of President-elect Biden, of course, is being labeled as more ready to build compromises and more ready to enter into dialogue. It will be very difficult to roll back all that has been done in terms of harmful measures. But what may be expected is not complete, but the reduction in tariffs that were imposed for at the level of the national security. And that will actually depend on how much progress we can see in finding solutions for the real problem that caused this trade war, which is technology war. And so, so I think that the dialogues will have to put together these two areas, and then see how trade can be made stop suffering, because the solutions for the other part are not found so easily.
Thank you very much. Thank
You're
you.
welcome.
Сейчас я хотел бы пригласить госпожу Людмилу Симонову, руководителя Центра экономических исследований Института Латинской Америки Российской академии наук. Теперь мы передвигаемся в Латинскую Америку. Пожалуйста, Лилия.
Добрый день, все слышно меня?
Hello, can you hear me just fine? Yes, we can hear you. Yeah, very well. That's great. First of all, would like to thank you for the invitation and for giving this opportunity to share our ideas about the situation in Latin America against the background of the pandemic and what happens in integration organization in Latin America, how they responded to the pandemic at the multilateral level. Of course, the pandemic had a major impact on Latin America and the quality of life of its populations. Quite impressive figures. 44 million people lost their jobs. Poverty level covered 37% of people, which is over 200 million of people, excluding some of them living in extreme poverty. And the second point that I wanted to highlight with these numbers, unprecedented measures that had been adopted by Latin American countries to combat the pandemic, they had impact on public budget, finances, especially considering the disbalances that had existed before the pandemic. As the Ministry of Economy of Brazil estimates, its deficit can reach 13%, which is quite important, and or 92% of GDP. So let's talk about trade policies. Obviously, lockdowns and closed borders coincided with the decrease of global trade. The largest decrease was in April, up to 70%. Physical exports volumes will be down by 7.7% in annualized. Exports are down 13.5%, which is the largest indicators across all the regions of the world. According to WTO calculations, pandemic also impacted the geography of foreign trade. So key supply of medical equipment and products to Latin America went from the United States to China. And China demonstrates quick recovery of its production capacities and also using Latin American raw materials. It is the driver for growth and social economic development for the next few years. To overcome consequences of the pandemic, governments of the Latin American countries have adopted policy measures to expand international ties and to fight COVID-19 pandemic. And four approaches in trade policies can be identified. The first one, liberalization of custom restrictions for goods used to combat the pandemic, and the use of temporarily freezing anti-dumping penalties for such protectionist countries as Argentina for specific categories of good, and Jamaica is on the same page. A hybrid approach to trade during the pandemic was conducted by Brazil. In March of 2020, they reduced custom duties for a whole spectrum of goods, especially goods related to combating COVID-19. but also goods from the same list that were produced in Brazil. They were banned for exports. So Peru, Paraguay, Ecuador followed in the steps of Brazil. And also import duties were cancelled for agricultural goods to ensure food reserves in such countries as Colombia, Costa Rica, and El Salvador. In some of the countries, mostly poorer countries in Latin America, they implemented a ban to export essential goods, especially food products. So those four categories of measures that we identified, what was they were able to achieve in terms at the leading integration blocks in Latin America to combat the pandemic and to support its member states. The first group is Mercosur. It's the largest, Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay. In the beginning of the pandemic, on March 18th of 2020, they made a decision to declare it jointly on regional coordination to overcome consequences of the pandemic of the coronavirus. In line with the declaration, borders were closed between member states and repatriation of citizens were organized. And for goods and services, it was stated that they intended to reduce tariffs and also protect pharmaceutical goods and other goods needed to fight COVID. So Mercosur Convergency Fund allocated about $6 billion for the countries, and $110 million were put in reserves for procurement of goods and equipment necessary to fight COVID-19. At the same time, pandemic also highlighted some contradictions between the members of the integration bloc, mostly in relation to third countries and treaties inside Mercosur. In this particular case, on April 24th of 2020, Argentina established the strictest quarantine measures. So unilaterally, it stopped its participation in Mercosur treaties with third countries except in EU and Eurasian Association of Free Trade. So they free such treaties with countries the Republic of Korea, Singapore, Lebanon, and India. So this decision contradicts one of the key treaties of Mercosur. So, so that requires to so some of the Mercosur participants, like some Republic of Korea, decided to postpone that until the end of the pandemic. Just a few words about the countries that are part countries and community. So like most other Latin American countries, they introduced lockdown regimes, but they opened borders open only for cargo transport, and each member state established temporary regimes for liberalization of trade and implemented unilateral restrictions. Speaking of the ANDS community during the quarantine period, so digitalization was spearheaded and also humanitarian procurement. Just a few words. So we have Chile, Peru. According to the Integrational Treaty,
И параллельно Альянс служит платформой для
And so it's a platform to interact with other major trade blocs. So Asian Pacific Alliance countries met with colleagues from ASEAN, and a roadmap was prepared to implement new working plan to cooperate between the two treaty blocs until 2023. The most centralized and advanced decisions were made in Central American integration bloc, SAIS, that quickly responded to the pandemic and the challenges that arose in those countries, and they produced a significant declaration, Central America Together, uniting against the coronavirus. So that was an important document of this integration bloc, but that declaration highlighted ways of joint action not only during the pandemic, but also in any kind of emergency. So how they should organize deliveries of essential food goods, how they could find the pandemic, etc. And also the last integration bloc, the Caribbean community. We know of that trade treaty of the countries of this Caribbean community with the external world, regulated mostly with two approaches during the pandemic in 2020. So the first one, they were a mediator for the countries to receive financial help from World Bank and other financial institutions. And also some of the countries of the Caribbean were able to receive additional funds to fight the pandemic from a regional healthcare project for the Caribbean community. In the second case, the Caribbean community agreed with other integration blocks about centralized purchase of medical equipment. And then they followed the same scheme in the Caribbean community and applied it to the African Union. Also wanted to say a few words about prospects of exiting this crisis and give you some figures, some numbers, some forecasts for Latin America that look not optimistic at all. And in many cases, outlook is quite negative compared to other regions of the world. So with zero growth in 2019, in 2020, GDP should shrink by almost 9%. This is IMF outlook, and recovery of the region will be slower compared to other countries in 2021, growth rates of 3.6%. And so this negative outlook is based on data from Mexico in Argentina. Mexico is quite dependent on the US market. And in Mexico, there was a major production downfall. All same is true for processing industry and mining industry. So they deliver their products to the US market. And another point that I wanted to highlight that was highlighted by SCAP. So global financial crisis of 2008 and 9 so government intervention and fiscal measures played a major role in that situation. It was exceptionally important to mitigate socioeconomic consequences. And we clearly understand that in the post-COVID period in Latin American countries, fiscal measures will be the key tool for economic recovery. And to improve the effectiveness of their fiscal measures, they should be done to improve for inclusive and equitable development in that region. Thank you for attention. Thank you very much for your um, detailed presentation. Probably we will ask the questions in the end. because we are lagging behind the schedule. So now we'd like to invite Mr. Ashibov, Deputy General Secretary of Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and he'll be talking about economic activity in the COVID-19 pandemic environment. Over to you.
Сергей Юрьевич, Игорь Георгиевич, уважаемые дамы
Thank
и
you so much,
господа.
dear Sergei Yuryevich, Igor Georgievich, dear ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to greet all of our participants today of our event organized by the Eurasian Economic Convention together with the State Bank. The proposed topic of the seminar has to do with the outlook on the development of world economy in the post-pandemic period is quite timely and relevant considering the great harm done to the public health care and the world economy, which provoked instability for the world goods market. Disruption of shipments and production have led to bankruptcy of many companies. First of all, small and middle entrepreneurship, the growth of unemployment in most countries in the world, including the union countries. It's worth noting that despite the difficulties that have to do with the pandemic and coronavirus, the countries have quite rapidly adapted to the new reality. On the summit took place in November, the membership state leaders spoke praise of Russian chairmanship as SCO, which provided new dynamics to the development of our organization. First of all, SCO became a lot more significant platform to develop measures to overcome the social, political, and epidemiological consequences of the pandemic based on the principles of Shanghai Spirit. Action plan for 2021-2025 has been approved on the execution of strategies of SCO development until 2025. In fact, it's a roadmap for organization that implies about conducting about 150 practical events along the whole range of multifaceted collaboration that's geared at the speedy recovery of the member states after the pandemic. The Moscow Declaration that was created by summit participants, the further strengthening of collaboration in all areas of public economy that are of common interest in the goal of open, sustainable development. Also, the need to create favorable conditions to trade was noted. That's needed for gradual implementation of free movement of goods, capital, services, and technologies, as it is provided by the SCO Charter. As a result of the summit, Tajikistan will take the chair in the organization. Tajikistan is planning to fully utilize the SCO potentials. Regarding the priorities in terms of economical interaction, Tajikistan is planning to focus on development of effective mechanism of support for a small and medium entrepreneurship and attracting investments along the Business Council and Bank Alliance, SCO Bank Alliance, collaboration together with the International Banking Institutes to conduct a first meeting at the level of industry ministers and of the member countries. Dear participants, despite all of the negative consequences of the pandemic and the coronavirus, they've offered us new opportunities. First of all, the pandemic crisis has sped up the process of digital transformation practically in all sectors of the state's social and economic life. It is obvious that digital economy and transborder e-trade will play an even more important role in restoring the world economy after the pandemic. In 2019, the global online sales were amounted to $3.5 trillion. Expert assessments say that the general overall volume of online sales will reach almost $5 trillion US by 2021, which will constitute 17.5% of the overall global retail sales. In November, at the SCO meeting, a multifaceted trade economical program was approved that opens a way for collaboration with an emphasis on digitalization and high tech. The advantages of digital economy will also lead to
предпринимательство подстегнет социальную
mass
мобильность и
entrepreneurs
обеспечит более широкое экономическое участие большинства.
to become more mobile.
Опыт известной корпорации Alibaba Group показывает, как цифровая
Alibaba experience shows how digital economy can become indispensable part of discovering new opportunities and can become a stimulus for inclusive growth by creating more than 46 million direct and indirect workplaces, and having provided through its platforms an opportunity for tens of millions of small and middle enterprises and startups. On November 5, 2018, Alibaba Group Corporation has signed an agreement with the federal, with the Belgian government on the opening of the first e-trade platform, EWTP. As a result, the medium and small business gets convenient conditions for transnational e-commerce and exporting goods into China. We consider it important to use the advantages of the technologies, leaving no one behind in the digital world after the pandemic. Developing the digital literacy among the SCO member states will create the conditions to integrate the necessary digital services throughout the whole organization space. In conclusion, I'd like to emphasize the importance of the memorandum on mutual understanding between the SCO Secretariat and the Eurasian Economic Commission that is now at the approval stage. And I'm sure this document will become an important step for developing a close and fruitful cooperation between the two regional structures. I hope that in course of today's speeches, there will be effective initiatives offered on the perspectives of growth of world economy in the post-pandemic period. Thank you for your attention. Thank you so much, Mr. Ashimov. I'd like to ask one little question. The multilateral trade program was accepted and was approved in 2003, and I understand it. For what I understand, it has been successful. Do you think the pandemic will actually introduce some changes into this program? I think it's not only this program will be altered. Life itself has changed due to the pandemic. We have to correct everything, and literally next week on November the 30th, we will have a meeting of the heads of governments, of state member heads of governments, a video conference chaired by the Indian party, and I think at this meeting, from the results of this meeting, you will learn of a lot of the measures that will be taken by our state and our state authority in order to introduce corrections and in order to execute this agreement in the post-pandemic period. Thank you so much, Mr. Ashimov. I wish you best of luck in your work. Thank you. And now I'd like to invite Mr. Belousov, head of short-term forecasting analysis center with the Center of Macroeconomic Analysis and short-term forecasting. Mr. Belousov doesn't have a specific topic. He asked to get an opportunity our topic today.
Сейчас, минуту, я запущу презентацию. Меня видно?
Give me a minute to start the presentation. Do you see me?
Было содержательным. Просто не могу не поблагодарить за очень высокое
I would
качество.
really like to thank for the quality report of papers, which has changed me to restructure certain concepts. We understand that we're really short on time. I can say one thing. The corona crisis on itself, it superimposed itself on the growing slowdown of the world economy that emerged in 2018. It's
России как производителю нефти там повезло в связи с уходом с рынка венесуэльской нефти, там и другими проблемами, но проблема-то была. Вот. Четко видно, что еще в 2019 году на биржах игроки начали быстро уходить из инвестиционных товаров золота в резервные активы. Стали
So we see the investors started to evaluate risk as high, and the crisis, as we saw it with lockdowns, it covered lower demand for energy sources. So it's not only about crisis innovation, but also review of corporate investment program. So now we see at the crest of the second wave, we see that European countries, they suffered so much. It's not very clear how they will deal with the situation without emission from other countries, because it's clearly they cannot have that emission on their own, because their economy doesn't work like that, and colossal amounts are needed on top of that. That structure suddenly highlighted international security issues and also local egotism. When remember how deliveries of masks and medical products were seized by some countries, and Asia-Pacific countries at the same time are overcoming crisis quickly. And China is not just resolving its own problems. They have some issues like environmental issues, but also they provide help to their partners at a large scale. And whether we like it or not, I understand there's some people who cannot accept this, but they started to export. That was not possible before, but now it became a reality. And in the last few months, and in the next few months, starting next year, they help to shape new positions of these players, unless we see some drastic changes with the new administration. In the US, transfer of power is already underway. In the United States, and stakes bets have been placed. The Democrats are for a high level, for a lot of loan emission. Indexes are growing, and investors leave gold. But the pandemic is not over. There's no real basis to expect new economic policy in the States. Traditionally, we have no doubt that what will be done to counter the emission. So on the opposite side of the emission, we see technological development. And it is true in a way. But in early 2000s, things could have been even worse. So until we learned from the crisis of 2008, so back in 2013, and also back in 2013, so situation was pretty difficult because the sanctions, but emission volumes were such that at that time, so there's active use of climatic and humanitarian agenda, and also restructuring of global treaties. So they take it as an offensive, competitive position, in, including implementation of climate and environmental standards and restrictions of similar kind for humanitarian reasons, um, in broad interpretation, with broad interpretation of the term, and also strengthening of U.S. unilateral position. So, of course, U.S. doesn't follow those environmental or carbon standards. And what we expect from Biden that will be a new approach to global treaties. So with deregulation and also transfer of American institution and legal decisions. So Russia faced that in view of American sanctions established by American courts with global application. So we see a more defensive position so on their part. So perhaps carbon indexes will be implemented to protect their markets from products, from EU products and from our products as well, and from Russian and Eurasian Economic Union countries. And such countries as and China has become offensive for the first time. It wants to become one of the global leaders in terms of green economy, solar generation, and China thankfully gets a lot of sunshine, and they promote, especially in Asia Pacific region, whether they're liked or not, their own social technologies that worked quite well during the pandemic. So at the crossroads of those three positions, as they were announced, we have technological development, we have crisis and positions of the players, and they show you can expect development of distance technologies and peopleless technologies, which are advantageous to reduce the number of people involved. The replacement and using remote technologies, also a new set of technologies related to surveillance and control and remote control. And in those situations, and we have seen it already traditionally, so using countries with cheap labor force. But our countries haven't been in that situation, so industrial robots of recent generations may come to such countries as Vietnam and Indonesia to replace their labor force because they're even cheaper and they can be adapted and they can replace uh, common workers. So discussing competitive advantages can be senseless here, because we cannot continue in the same vein anymore. So we can talk here about a leap, and EU representative said recently that to describe the situation, you should use some, the crisis is described with some letters. So, and the Russian language has a letter to offer. It's a letter Sh, which has 3 spikes. So there are opportunities to develop platforms, but on the other hand, we see that development and of new currencies that we expected in the beginning of this year did not happen, and global institutions remain, and the new position of the US will impact those institutions. So, especially in the light of this rivalry between US and China. But that creates risks of general destabilization in the world. We can still face these situations when those institutions are not equal in terms of their impact. So the old system is still being destroyed. So when you cover your consumption or boost your consumption by creating debt in other countries and also using cheap labor force of other countries, what we've seen a rapid growth of corporate debt in regions which received funds to help local businesses. So my last idea, we need to be proactive in this situation. So we are living in a world that is facing one crisis after another. But at the same time, technological development and market growth have their impact. So we have this window of opportunity, with technologies and growing markets in place. But if we miss it, we will be in a worse situation unless the Eurasian Economic Union really works on this integration, which holds back our potential in its realization, the use of synergy, then sovereignty will not be strengthened, but on the opposite, it will be weakened. So, because we have such major powers as US and China, so we should be proactive. So in some areas, we are proactive, maybe infrastructure development in terms of digital technologies, but in other areas, especially throughout the crisis, we missed on some of the opportunities. We can have some opportunities in transport, in the energy sector, in the pharmaceutical sector, for our southern countries of the Eurasian Economic Union. So with the new American administration in place, security problems may be increased for our countries and economies. So the integrity of our transport, energy, and digital infrastructure may be threatened. So we need to have independent channels that do not depend on American policies, and we should have sufficient buffer. So remember what happened with the European Court, and also with the during the previous crisis, we were able to overcome this FX crisis with the depreciation of our currencies when our partners depreciated their currencies in parallel, and we realized that we had some time before that crisis materialized. And we had a good reason to develop institutions of cooperation and to better manage our finances as much as possible. So this is an ambitious goal, but I think it's quite doable. It's not like developing thermonuclear synthesis in 2 weeks. I think it's much more doable than that. Thank you for that. Thank you for your recommendations for the economic European Union positions in view of the changes in global economy that will be reviewed and taken into account. Thanks for that. So now, excuse me. Now I would like to give the floor to Mr. Bryuhanov, Deputy Head of Россотрудничества. And Mr. Bryuhanov will be talking about intergovernment program between CIS countries in the light of pandemic.
I'd like to thank seminar participants for an opportunity to speak. I'd also like to greet the organizers. And I very much like the topic of your seminar. I'd like to propose a treatment, or maybe substitute the words treatment and prevention more, make it more like reanimation. I think it's more in line with the current state of affairs. Can you hear me? Yes, we can hear you just fine. Can you remove the previous presentation from the screen, the presentation by a previous speaker? Could you ask Mr. Belousov to stop screen sharing? I apologize. I'd like to draw your attention to one event that happened practically yesterday. Well, actually not yesterday, it happened on November 6th at a meeting of the heads of government by CIS countries. There was an interstate program for innovation collaboration for CIS members until 2030. Collaboration in communications and medical technologies. It's not even a whole list of areas that could and must unite the states within our space in the current conditions of the pandemic. The key objectives of the interstate program are the following: determining the priority areas for innovation collaboration and priorities for joint activities, development of markets and technologies, development of infrastructure for collaboration in industry and science, and regulation of interstate innovation collaboration. The program was handled by an independent international group of developers. So there were 29 directions established there. Don't worry, I'm not going to list them all. I'd like to mention just a few: intellectual, transport and logistics systems, both on land, in the sea, and on air. Digital or manufacturing system and digital industrial infrastructure, effective agriculture, including logistic solutions, biotechnology, and veterinary studies, sensorics, robot technologies, photonics, and of course biotechnologies and genetics, and infrastructures and resources for fundamental research, so-called mega sites. Developers proposed 11 key initiatives for the program that could significantly strengthen the opportunities for both research institutes as well as small and medium enterprise on organizing a joint activity in order to create a real impulse for commercialization of innovation products, which is a hard thing for most of our startups. Create some sort of an export for infrastructure for export systems. In our opinion, all of it would create an innovation space for all of the members and provide equal opportunities and conditions in joint use of technological and innovation potentials of the member states. I'd like to note that the Federal Collaboration Agency is handling only some of the functions of the program. Skolkovo found is an observer of the program, and it's led by Interstate Council for the CIS. So all of them, so the participants of Interstate program are determined by the ministry, the so-called national customer that are responsible for execution of the strategic document on a national level. Along with their help, we have put together a team of researchers, industry specialists, and entrepreneurs, science managers, and educations, development institutes representatives that have created this quite modern template for a document. Well, actually, it's not no longer a document project. It actually came into power on November 6th. It was conceived as far as the realization mechanism could not only be developed among the member states, but also there were also solutions that allowed external partners to get involved at the various stages of program realization and being involved in joint research and industrial cooperation. At the development stage, having with the help of Israel representatives, there was a desire expressed to take part in a program that came from Israeli Innovation Institute. Interest was expressed also from China. We think that the execution of this interstate program will allow the participants to increase export of science-intensive goods. The execution of the program, in our opinion, must serve with a proper execution serve as a strong foundation for implementation of new technologies and support of small and medium entrepreneurs in innovation sectors, which will provide for new workplaces, increased quality of life for the member states, and will generally serve the goal as SDG, which is the key objective of our program. I'd like to thank you for the invitation to take part in such a seminar. I'd like to once again thank the organizers and greet all of the participants. I wish you best of luck with your work. Thank you so much, Mikhail Dmitrievich. You had quite an interesting message that you shared. We're not going to ask questions right away but we do have some. I'd like to propose, considering that we're running out of time, I understand that the 10 minutes per speech when we meet once a year on discussing such a global issue, I think it's absolutely insufficient. That's why I have a proposal that the issues the questions that you may have, you're free to ask each other, because we're all in touch, more so. And it'll also be interesting to see the answers and make them public, and that will allow them for them to be used in the work of the Eurasian Commission when analyzing the results, the outcomes of this conference. So I propose you use this opportunity to ask each other questions, but make it public. And now I'd like to pass the floor to Mr. Alexander Averchenkov. He's the head of Partnership Support Office at the UN Development Program. And the speech topic is a joint work by Russian role within trust funds. Mr. Averchenko, please take the floor.
Hello, dear colleagues. I would like to thank the organizers for the invitation, for the opportunity to speak. I participated in many previous seminars, and this time I'm a speaker. Obviously, the pandemic has had an impact on priorities and mechanisms of international cooperation and development, on providing aid to developing countries and other countries. They need help to achieve sustainable development goals in other UN agendas. In my presentation, I would like to focus on these issues, primarily the mechanism of determining priority needs of specific countries in terms of recovery after the pandemic, and also cooperation between Russia and Eurasian economic countries and CIS countries with United Nations Development Program. We are present in multiple countries, not only in the countries, but also in major cities and regions. We help to evaluate socio-economic impact of the pandemic and develop plans of response. Um, we work pretty much in all the countries, and we focus estimates. We estimate a business and economic and population impact of the pandemic. We use official stats, and also interviews with SMEs, households. In some of the countries, Uzbekistan, we had targeted study at the municipal level. Based on the results of the spring wave of the pandemic, the UNDP in cooperation with other institutions estimated pandemic consequences for the countries. Now we have additional evaluations. We review some of the recommendations, considering the developments of the situation this fall. So UNDP looks at the consequences, a continuous process, and as a tool for implementing, for making amendments to our recommendations. Developing countries' governments and their response is aimed not only at amending their programs, but also using financial and other resources to help those governments to deal with most urgent issues. And the second issue about cooperation between Russia and UNDP, many partner countries turn to Russia with help they turn for financial help, for intellectual help, transfer of competencies and expertise, and Russia provided help in unilateral and multilateral uh, ways, including UNDP. We have a trust fund of UNDP and Russian Federation that was created in 2015 to support activities um, in different parts of the world, and specifically in CIS country. This trust foundation is a joint mechanism of managing resources and to select best project for financial support. A management committee includes a Ministry of Foreign Affairs and other ministries, as well as representatives of UNDP. So in 5 years of existence, the Russian um, government provided $86 billion for projects in neighboring countries, and altogether 30 projects in over 30 countries were run. So I support was to provide better labor conditions, better medical conditions, etc. So to improve quality of life for beneficiaries, over 2,500 of local and regional organizations participated in those projects. Also, dissemination of best practices in Russia and establishing horizontal ties between Russian companies and partner countries are of importance. Over 160,000 Russian specialists and organizations participated in those ties. On a systemic basis, we create an open database of Russian experts that have access, that any organization may have access to, and involve them, engage them directly to work with them. A trust fund is a great tool with its tools and procedures to support development. We have a two-stage selection process, which is key. So for every competition, we have geographic scope, maximum funding amount, a managing committee establishes the criteria for applications. I would like to stress that projects funded by a trust fund are in line with national priorities of the relevant countries. So this spring, the Russian government allocated additional funds for the trust fund for projects of priority to fight the pandemic. So application were received in CIS countries, in Latin American countries, and yesterday the board of the trust fund approved 9 projects and allocated resources for implementation of those projects in several countries, including countries of the Eurasian Economic Union. So a project was approved to strengthen stability of um, rural communities in Armenia, so to provide to help them in socioeconomic recovery in those rural areas to overcome the economic and coronavirus crisis. It's very important because pandemic touched pretty much all the regions of Armenia and over 76,000 confirmed cases, and in terms of per capita rates, it's one of the highest in the world. In October, they registered 2,000 new cases daily, and now the situation is worse because of the um, people fleeing Nagorno-Karabakh. Another project that was approved for Kyrgyzstan to for social cohesion improvement, job creation, improved labor conditions, and also improving medical services, and also working with women and youth. Similar approaches were used in Tajikistan, where a series of projects is planned for execution, and we've had some projects on improving food security. In Cuba, we supported job creation and jobs in Guantanamo province, those who work in cattle farming. And considering the situation in Cuba because of the pandemic and trade restrictions. So I suppose that these projects will help not only support the countries that suffered from the crisis, but also help establish horizontal links. And the Eurasian Economic Commission may also be involved on some of the projects because they can allow the use of platforms and the expertise. And a new publication of UNDP, it's a report on socioeconomic consequences of COVID-19 in Central Asia, where lockdowns and closed borders and other factors reduced economic activity and increased poverty. According to the report, difficulties already were larger than consequences of the financial crisis of 2008. Besides the report, UNDP will prepare a report on the consequences of the pandemic in other regions of the Balkans and the Caucasian region. Thank you for your attention. That's it. Thank you very much, Alexander, for your overview of the activity of UNDP in CIS countries and beyond. I'm sure that's pretty helpful. Okay, now I would like to give the floor to Anna Zolotarevska that comes from Moscow Chamber of Trade and Industry, and she will talk about social exchanges that should help sustainable development.
Good evening, good day, colleagues. I have to switch. It's not working. The connection is not working here. I'd like to share a presentation with you.
Уважаемые коллеги,
Dear colleagues, right now I'd like to tell you about the work done by the Trade Industry Chamber. Perhaps you have two devices here, and one of them is you need to turn off the sound on one of your devices, and we'll have no problems. Okay, that's it. Is that better?
Сейчас хорошо, пожалуйста.
Так вот видим, да? Все хорошо, спасибо большое. Я хотела бы
I'd
кратко...
like to briefly speak of how Moscow Trade and Industry Chamber works on solving the tasks of SDG. Our colleagues and I were heading a work group with the analytical center of the Russian Federation. It's worthy employment and economical growth. As a process of this project, that the given reports do not include small business, micro business, and non-commercial sector and the actual community. The current pandemic has shown that the social sector, that is a foundation of employment, available employment, has collapsed, and now we have automation of major companies. Also, people are being fired, or people are working online, or people are being let go. And in Russia, in Moscow, 30% of the workforce must work and work online, and it's very difficult to work in such chaos. And the most important thing is that the population is suffering from this. So the population actually has to provide for their children and for the elderly parents. So the social sector has suffered. But we need to understand that the social sector, once again, it provides accessible social services and accessible employment that is in high demand, and that's something that we have to solve urgently. And the actual sustainable development goals are geared at improving the quality of life. And right now, we're not speaking of improving the quality of life, but at least maintaining it. And a Chamber of Trade and Industry based on the decrees by the Russian government. We talk about the May decrees and national goals that foster the growth of human capital, creation of a comfortable environment, some sort of economical growth. And all of these projects transition to local projects. And as part of working with the regions and with non-commercial sectors, with their social projects and social entrepreneurs, we came to the conclusion that we could create voluntary regional reviews that will allow the administration locally to see who's there in the social sector, what preferences can be given, what dotations can be provided. And right now we're not talking about some sort of a financial backing, but we're talking about maybe exchange, providing resources that are possessed by both the small business and the local administration, just in order to support the population at such a difficult time. Based on the Trade Industry Chamber has created a business market. It also works on an international level now. It includes 25 countries world over now, and based on this platform, we've created the first social exchange. So the social projects that the Trade and Industry Chamber can provide for with its resources or its member resources are being restructured, assessed, and provides for their relatively stable activity. And that's what the Chamber of Trade and Industry can do now, and that's something that the small and medium business can do. So that makes the business socially responsible, being a part of such social projects. So where does it all come from? Once again, it came from an international market. For both our major companies are branches that do trade in international markets. They report in terms of non-financial reporting within the goals of SDG, disclosing their public information on the 17 goals that are aimed at improving the quality of life and avoiding austerity. And the same parameters are used for assessing projects for both small business and non-commercial sector, and thus give the business opportunities to become socially responsible and be a part of a chain of responsible suppliers for bigger companies, and thus supporting their business. And from what I've seen in our colleagues' report, the development of the niches such as high tech, pharmaceuticals, in order for the small business, the micro business that provides the resources, they need to be supported at least in some way. And also with our Sustainable Development Guild that deals with social projects, we have experience organizing similar structures in other trade and industry chambers, and we're entering the international market, and we're exchanging experience on how trade and industry chambers can support the population, the small and medium business, involving it by involving it into achieving SDGs. Because as practice shows, when it comes to voluntary national reviews, they should not only reflect the participation of major companies that, of course, make a great contribution to the country's social policy, but also the small business that, and the non-commercial sector. And what's the demand for it? I mean, we're talking about social projects like forest restorations, cleaning rivers, or ecology. Those things are in demand in national projects as well, and their reports as well. So they're part of informational monitoring, and their work is seen. And in the end, when there's a clear report and a clear contribution of this organization into the economy, to the social economy of the country, naturally, the preferences, clear preferences are given. That's once again getting back to the state budget through social projects or the social effect, and thus providing the social economy with a factor of improvement of quality of life. Thank you so much. Thank you, Anna Stanislavovna. I see you have quite a big presentation here. Yeah, I understand that we're short on time, but we'll all get to see the presentation. Thank you for your presentation. And right now, I'd like to pass the floor to our final speaker for the day. It's Ms. Anna Kiobi, regular representative for International Monetary Fund in Russia. The topic, COVID pandemic and the opportunities for the social economy.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So good afternoon. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak again at the Eurasian Economic Commission. It's unfortunate that we're not all here together today. To wrap up the conference, I will just give you a very brief overview of how we at the International Monetary Fund view the economic outlook and what we suggest as the policy response to the pandemic. But before getting onto the outlook, I just wanted to share some very few slides on the pandemic. So far, we've counted more than 59 million infections, 1.4 million deaths. The pandemic has kept spreading in the summer in emerging markets. This is the line in red, but has stabilized somewhat. In advanced countries, we saw a lull in the summer, followed by a massive resurgence of infections with case counts nearly 2 times as high as the summer peaks. The share of deaths, however, remains lower than during the first wave. In low-income countries, this is the blue line. The number of cases and the number of deaths has remained significantly lower, but perhaps this is issues with undercounting of cases and insufficient tests. In response to the second pandemic wave, countries have reimposed broad-based containment policies, most notably in Western Europe, to limit the buildup of pressure on healthcare systems. In response to the second wave, we've seen a reduction in mobility. So here I plot a few of the large emerging and advanced economies. And what we see is that mobility has decreased the most in Western Europe. This is in countries like Germany, France, Italy, and Spain. This is the red line. We see a similar trend in Russia, the gray line. In addition, or with this reduction in mobility, we've also seen a slowdown of the growth momentum in Q3. In particular, in some of the large major economies. So for example, in the Euro area, we've seen a reduction in October PMIs, and also in the United Kingdom, which is denoted by GBR in these set of charts. The recovery in trade has been uneven so far. Global trade in goods contracted sharply, but it's on course to recover more quickly from the pandemic than we saw after the global financial crisis. In the left-hand side chart, we plot high-frequency indicator data on both the volume and the value of imports. And we see that starting in June, the recovery has lost some steam, at least since August. The trade outlook is particularly bleak for tourism-dependent economies, where restrictions on international travel, together with consumer fears of infections, are likely to weigh heavily on tourist activity, even in situations where the pandemic appears contained. Here, the blue line is flight departures. And as you can see, it picked up in August, but has come back down again in September. In labor markets, we see that employment dropped sharply at the peak of the lockdown. This is the left-hand side chart. And while it has rebounded in a few countries, it still remains far below pre-pandemic levels. The biggest employment losses have been in the US, Canada, and in emerging markets, Colombia. Employment losses have been much lower in the Euro area countries, for example, Italy and Germany. But this is a function of the short-term work schemes that they put in place to support employment. So just as an example, France effectively nationalized the labor market, and the French government was providing 80% of wages across all corporates in the affected sectors. From the right-hand side chart, we see that the pandemic has hit more severely low-skilled jobs, further polarizing the labor market. Here we plot the change in the unemployment rate by education. And what we find is that the biggest increase in unemployment has been among those people with less than a basic education. This is the second bar. The least impacted demographic and those that have seen the smallest increase in unemployment are those with advanced degrees. So this unprecedented crisis has resulted similarly in an unprecedented policy response. Fiscal measures announced as of September are estimated at some $11.7 trillion globally, or 12% of global GDP. Half of these measures consist of discretionary spending, direct support to households and corporates, or foregone revenues in the form of tax deferrals or temporary tax cuts. And the other half has been in the form of liquidity support, including loans, guarantees, and equity injections by the public sector. Fiscal space considerations, including financing constraints, have likely tempered the fiscal policy response in the pandemic in emerging markets and low-income countries relative to advanced countries. And just comparing the size of the discretionary fiscal response in EMs versus advanced countries, it's about half the size of the advanced economy response. Interest rates were cut where possible. This is the second chart on the right. And the red bar shows the increase in the share of countries with interest rates lower than 1%. Almost all countries are at the zero lower bound, meaning that it would be difficult to cut interest rates further without financial stability effects. And what advanced countries have done is that they've resorted to unconventional monetary policy. So this is asset purchases, in some instances even of corporate bonds. Many emerging markets have lowered their policy rates too. And a number of EMs are also getting closer to the zero lower bound. And they've followed the advanced economy trend in also purchasing, here it's mostly government assets. This unprecedented response has been crucial to limiting the economic and social damage from this pandemic. With this, let me quickly show you our October growth projections. So for global growth, we projected at minus 4.4% in 2020. This is some 0.8 percentage points above the forecast we made in June. And the stronger projection for 2020 reflects the net effect of two competing factors. So the first is we've seen much better than anticipated second quarter GDP outturns in advanced economies. And this is thanks to the massive fiscal support that was given to the economy by national governments. And the second thing that this forecast reflects is the downward drag from second round restrictions in activity in Q3 and possibly into Q4. In 2021, we project a rebound in global growth to 5.2% of GDP. Growth in the advanced economy group, this was the most hard-hit group. They had the most severe lockdowns across our group of economies, is projected at minus 5.8%. The US economy is projected to contract by 4.3%. The euro area is expected to have an even deeper contraction of 8.3% of GDP. The Asian economies, specifically the advanced Asian economies, are projected to have a somewhat more moderate downturn than those in Europe in light of the more contained pandemic, and also in light of the fact that they saw much smaller GDP declines during the first half of 2020. For 2021, the advanced economy growth rate is projected to strengthen to 3.9%, but the level of GDP in 2021 is still going to be some 2% below what it was in 2019. Turning to our emerging markets and low-income countries, overall, we expect the group to shrink by 3.3% in 2020. We've seen some positive outturns in the data, specifically in China. Both in Q2 and into the rest of the year. And this has also provided some support to other emerging markets through spillovers. But in the other emerging and developing economies, the news is not so uniformly positive. Q2 GDP growth was weaker than projected, for instance, in India, where domestic demand plunged following a very sharp compression of consumption and a collapse in investment. Other countries have seen massive reductions in remittance flows, which also have weighed on domestic spending, for example, the Philippines. Growth in 2021 is forecast to rebound to 6% in emerging markets. And as in 2020, prospects for China are much stronger than in other countries. With the hit to commodity prices, commodity exporting economies are projected to decline by 5.1% in 2020. Let me quickly draw your attention to Russia. The economic impact of the combined shock, both the health shock from COVID and the associated lockdowns, and also the dramatic drop in oil prices earlier this year was indeed severe. But the impact in Russia is not as large as in other emerging markets. And part of this is explained by the relatively small services sector, and for once, the resilience of the Russian economy through the large share of protected public employment in the public sector, in state-owned enterprises. And last but not least, a really significant policy response from our fiscal authorities and also from the monetary authorities. We've seen cuts in interest rates to historic lows, a lot of financial sector support through regulatory forbearance and the release of capital buffers to encourage lending in the economy, and things like the mortgage subsidy scheme that supported growth in the construction sector. And perhaps just a last point, the lockdown in Russia, in some sense, was also more targeted in the decision to exempt many companies in the industrial sector from the lockdown, for instance. And this is the route that a lot of Western European economies are going to in their second round of lockdown. Lastly, on the low-income countries, growth is expected to be least affected. And here for 2020, we expect a contraction of 1.2 and a rebound to almost 5% in 2021. We expect the pandemic to leave scars, so we don't think it's only going to be a near-term impact on growth. We expect some reduction in medium-term growth as well. And this first chart just compares our January projections of per capita cumulative growth over 2019 to 2025, this is the blue bar, to what we project for growth over the same period now. This is the red bar. And here you see it's really only a very partial recovery. So for the world, in January, we projected a cumulative growth of 14 percentage points, whereas it's something like 10 percentage points now. For EMs, the hit is particularly large. We expected growth pre-pandemic in January to be somewhere between 20 to 22 percentage points between 2019 to 2025 cumulatively, and we've reduced our projections to 16 percentage points. Just on the very last chart, the economies that are projected to do worst in the medium term are the Latin American countries. And with that, I conclude our presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Annette, for your presentation. As usual, it's very visual and refined and easy to comprehend. Many thanks, many thanks.
Thank you, and very quick.
So at this, we have exhausted our agenda, and I would like to give the floor to Sergei Glazyev to conclude our video conference. So, Sergei.
Thank you so much, Igor Georgievich. Thank you, dear colleagues, for taking part in the seminar, for the interesting papers. Yes, we really are going through some very difficult times. And studying from international experience and attempts to organize joint programs to overcome the outcomes of the pandemic, to stimulate the economic activity in all the countries is a crucial task at the moment. And I'd like to say that within the Eurasian Economical Union, we're doing a lot of work when it comes to joint measures on overcoming the consequences of the pandemic. And these measures are not only of epidemiological character, and they're not limited to issues of trade. Right now, we're completing work on some strategic directions for the development of Eurasian economical integration until 2025. And I think it's quite relevant because within the framework of the strategic development, the Eurasian Economical Commission has tasks for developing strategic plans for the development of the Eurasian Economical Union, to execute joint programs, to launch wide-scale investment projects, including development of infrastructure, and organize collaboration in the innovation sector, including international collaboration, in particular exchange of research results, shaping common priorities for the economical development, our competitive combination of our competitive benefits. So we're in a state of active search, and the changes that are taking place say that unfortunately large areas of stagnation economical stagnation are created, both in terms of industry. A lot of industries, in fact, are down, especially in the service areas. They can get back up on their feet. The state barely keeps them afloat, and there are whole regions after, especially given the presentation on Latin America, made quite an impression. When it comes to the growth of austerity and the loss of employment and unemployment. So we need to think of what could be the new directions for development, considering that the World Health Organization is forecasting a third wave of the pandemic, and we see that despite the fact there's some success in developing vaccines, and they're starting to be broadly used, but still the next year will also most likely be a pandemic. So these optimistic assessment are quite inspiring. This world is going to get out of the recession, but I don't think that not all of the countries can count on that. So we need to strengthen our partnership, and I think that our next conference can be dedicated to the issues of strategic priorities. Find the collaboration areas where we could get the best results, considering the new technological order and the pandemic limitations that are still in place. Thank you all for participation. It was a very useful and interesting event. Thank you so much, Sergei Yuryevich. Thank you for your words of conclusion. From my part, I'd also like to say that today we have seen a wide-scale review of economical, financial, and social situation in some countries in the world and in the global regional centers. Our task now, and first of all, it's for the Eurasian Economical Commission, is to weed out the information that will help the Eurasian Economical Commission to use it in terms of revision and developing our activities in the condition of pandemic on the territory of Eurasian Economical Union, and that's the work that's already being done as a part of strategy revision and determining a new strategy for the Eurasian Union for the future. I'd like to thank the organizers of our conference, the Eurasian Economical Commission. I would like to thank all of the participants for the contribution that was made, despite the fact that we are also remote. We have spent a lot of time together. I'd like to apologize for having delays. We didn't manage to finish the conference on time. We weren't able to discuss all of the questions that were accumulated over time. But really, such a conference does take some time, and 10 minutes per paper is just simply not enough. So we'll make note of these mistakes for the future. And once again, I'd like to ask you all to present all of your questions and answers, present them to all of the participants, so we can use your knowledge when facing when dealing with tasks with objectives they're facing. So be well, take care. Thank you.